One wrong turn, one single bullet, and the entire world burst into flames. In the summer of 1914, a teenage assassin pulled a trigger in Sarajevo, killing the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Within just 30 days, a secret web of global alliances collapsed like dominoes, dragging 30 nations and 70 million soldiers into the most brutal slaughterhouse human history had ever seen. They called it the war to end all wars, but it was actually the birth of a terrifying new world order. Today on Global 19, we're looking past the textbook history to uncover the raw truth, how a single royal assassination shattered empires, redrew the map of the earth, and left behind a toxic legacy that still shapes global conflict today.
Now, one wrong turn? I know, it sounds like a lazy fictional movie plot, right? But it is absolute, verifiable, historical fact. On June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, a royal driver navigating these winding streets literally took a wrong turn down a side alley. He stalled the car, and in doing so, he inadvertently changed the course of human history forever. It's the ultimate and honestly the most terrifying butterfly effect. A simple, everyday navigational error that doomed millions and completely altered the trajectory of the 20th century.
Because that one mundane driving mistake, it placed the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, directly in front of a teenage assassin named Gavrilo Princip. And when Princip pulled the trigger, he didn't just assassinate a royal. No, he fired a single bullet that ignited an unprecedented global apocalypse. I mean, think about it. A localized political grievance instantly became the spark that blew up the known world. So to understand exactly how a single street corner event dragged 30 different nations into all-out war, we really need to treat this like a geopolitical postmortem. We'll be running a quick threat assessment covering the trigger, the alliances, the slaughter, the fall, and finally, the peace. All right, let's dive right into part one, the trigger. Sarajevo, June 1914. You really have to consider the sheer speed of this descent. It is literally a ticking clock. Day one, Princip assassinates the Archduke, but instead of a localized mourning period, the panic just spreads like a virus. By week two, we're seeing these severe, unyielding diplomatic ultimatums flying across European borders. Nations are making absolutely impossible, pride-fueled demands of one another. Week three, massive secret alliances start mobilizing millions of troops in this desperate, paranoid race just to not be caught off guard. And by day 30, global war is officially declared. It took exactly 30 days for the dominoes to fall, just 1 month to transform a single act of violence into an inescapable, continent-wide conflagration. Which brings us to part two, the secret web of alliances, the global trap. Now, the world in 1914 was already incredibly volatile, right? It was thoroughly poisoned by decades of imperialism, massive arms races, and extreme nationalism. But the true fatal flaw, the thing that really doomed everyone, was the secret alliance system. This was a rigid, hidden network of defense treaties connecting the major powers, and it essentially guaranteed that if one nation went to war, all the others would automatically be dragged in. There was no reverse gear here, no emergency brake. No nation could back down to preserve peace without betraying their allies and pulling the entire continent into the fire with them. It was a massive geopolitical bomb, just waiting for a single match. So the globe ends up split by this inescapable us versus them standoff. On one side, you've got the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. On the flip side, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So when Austria-Hungary moves against Serbia after the assassination, Russia immediately steps in to defend Serbia. And because of those secret pacts we just talked about, that action automatically pulls in Germany, which then automatically pulls in France and Britain. You see how the trap just snaps shut? Within weeks, 30 different nations were mathematically doomed to fight, bound by promises made behind closed doors long before the first shot was ever fired. Let's move on to part three, the slaughter. Old tactics clashing with new tech. 70 million. I really want you to just say that number out loud and let it sink in. 70 million soldiers were deployed from their homes, taken away from their families, and fed straight into what became a brand new, completely mechanized meat grinder. The sheer overwhelming scale of this global military mobilization was unlike anything humanity had ever attempted or honestly even imagined before. And the real horror began once they hit the battlefield. You had commanders who were still stubbornly using 19th century tactics, literally sending men charging in traditional, tightly packed lines, sometimes even on horseback, straight into 20th century industrial technology. They marched totally unprotected against rapid-fire machine guns that could spit out hundreds of rounds a minute. They choked on the terrifying introduction of chemical poison gas, which was an entirely new frontier of psychological and physical suffering. They saw the very first heavily armored tanks crushing the earth. All of this while trapped in brutal, disease-ridden trench warfare, where guys lived in mud and rats and sheer terror for months on end. This fatal clash, outdated tactics versus devastating new tech, is exactly what caused millions of immediate, horrifying casualties. The very nature of war fundamentally, permanently changed forever, right there in the mud. Next up is part 4, the fall, redrawing the map. Because you have to understand, this war completely shattered the existing world order. When the smoke finally cleared years later, we saw the staggering, simultaneous wipeout of 4 massive, centuries-old powers: the German Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Just gone. All of them collapsed completely, sweeping away these ancient royal dynasties that had ruled for generations. The map of the Earth was violently redrawn. And that created massive power vacuums and these entirely new, artificially drawn borders that, by the way, are still the direct source of profound geopolitical conflict today in places like Eastern Europe and the modern Middle East. Finally, that leads us to part 5, the peace, or rather, the Treaty of Versailles. So, the guns finally stopped firing, but the peace treaty they ultimately signed, it was actually a ticking time bomb. The public goal of the Treaty of Versailles sounded incredibly optimistic. They wanted it to be the war to end all wars. But the geopolitical reality was very different, and honestly, far more vindictive. The strict terms of the treaty resulted in the absolute financial, military, and global humiliation of Germany. Rather than actually resolving the deep underlying geopolitical tensions or attempting any kind of true reconciliation, enforcing this kind of total humiliation laid a really dark, toxic groundwork for the decades to come. It purposefully seeded an anger and desperation that would fester, grow, and eventually boil over on an even larger scale. Which leaves us with this pretty haunting realization. When you look at this entire domino effect, the secret alliances, the devastating birth of mechanized industrial slaughter, and then a peace treaty built almost entirely on punishment and humiliation, did the war to end all wars actually just guarantee the next one? It's an absolutely crucial takeaway for anyone studying history. A flawed, vindictive peace directly paves the path for future conflict. The echoes of 1914 still shape the way nations interact, form alliances, and view one another right now. Keep that in mind the next time you look at a global map. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.